I want to welcome you to the session on theory and culture. And let me just mention, as Charles did earlier, that the Curb Center has been participating in a program called Story Booth, and we encourage you to take part in the Story Booth project by taking a few minutes to record your thoughts and reflections about the humanities or about the Warren Center in the Story Booth during the course of the day. Thanks. We'll have 4 10-minute presentations followed by discussion, and we encourage you to participate in that dialogue. Our first speaker is Susan Hegeman, who's professor of English at the University of Florida. She's written 2 books on the concept of culture in the U.S. She's currently working on a project on indigeneity in a global context, and another on the history of the popular social sciences in the mid-20th century in the U.S. Professor Hegeman was a Fulbright Distinguished Scholar in American Studies in Sweden in 2012, and she was a William S. Vaughan Visiting Fellow at the Warren Center in 1996-97 for the Question of Culture seminar. Professor Hegeman.
Thank you. Well, again, to add to the other expressions of gratitude and appreciation for everything that happens at the Warren Center, I add mine, and also thanks to Jay Clayton and Jim Epstein and Paul Friedman, who, and of course Mona, who made my year here very, very important, as you will perhaps guess from my comments today. So in 1996-97, the colloquium topic at the Warren Center was the question of culture. And I was here revising my first book, which had also been my dissertation, on ideas of culture in the early part of the 20th century U.S. At the time of my stay at Vanderbilt, and for several decades before this, culture was a central term, a key word, of humanistic discourse, which was, of course, one of the reasons why I had hitched my academic wagon to it. This period of the 1980s and 90s has sometimes even been referred to as the moment of the humanistic cultural turn. This was the moment of cultural studies, new cultural history, multiculturalism. Culture as a word was often perceived as frustratingly difficult to pin down, but I'd argue that one thing it really stood for in this moment of the cultural turn was interdisciplinarity itself. The drive to combine different forms of humanistic and, I would say, interpretive social scientific thought into novel approaches and configurations that grasped at something like social complexity. The other reason I had hitched my wagon to culture was that I was deeply interested in the project of cultural anthropology, and I was interested in finding intersections between that field and literary history. So my own thinking was very interdisciplinary. But as the idea of a turn implies, things can also be turned away from. And just as soon as I was finishing up that first book manuscript, it became clear that this cultural turn was showing some signs of fatigue. And I was struck last night at the film to see our old, the poster for the speaker series that we put together called Questioning Culture. And maybe in retrospect, this is another sign of that turn away from culture being experienced in our very group. Culture remained a vexing idea, and quality interdisciplinary work remained hard to do and hard to assess, but I would say there were also new macrological issues at work in this moment, which helped to turn the cultural turn, including a mounting political critique of cultural pluralism and multiculturalism, enabled in part by 9/11 and the War on Terror, and a trend toward disciplinary conservatism on the part of academics who were often quite correctly worried about the fate of their home disciplines and departments. In the last decade, and perhaps a little more, the closure of departments of anthropology, sociology, classics, folklore, modern languages, and philosophy, among others, have inclined many to see interdisciplinarity itself as the enemy. If only, the logic goes, we can justify what our discipline does and what nobody else's does, then we will surely avoid the axe. I think this kind of thinking is entirely understandable emotionally, but for reasons I'd be happy to go into, it's a fallacious understanding of how neoliberal universities operate. At any rate, it makes for a climate of retreat into disciplinary verities. which in my literary neck of the woods go by names like the new formalism, in film studies, cinephilia, and we could probably extend that. This is sometimes, in fact, called collectively the aesthetic turn. Which brings me to another book, written under far less congenial circumstances than my first one, called The Cultural Return. There I laid out the history of the cultural turn of the 80s and 90s in much greater length than I could hope to do today, and addressed the various challenges to cultural scholarship that then emerged, and then tried to make the case for why keeping the space open for interdisciplinarity is so essential now, for which culture is as good a name as any. Indeed, I argued that we may as well pay attention to culture as a concept because its long history, one that considerably predates the cultural turn, is also part and parcel of our conceptual apparatus for thinking about questions of part and whole, particularly the relationship of subject and social totality. In a moment of a dramatically shifting geopolitical landscape, it seemed to me that it was important to be careful about prematurely jettisoning our theoretical apparatuses. And I'm not alone in thinking that culture has some utility yet. It is not a surprise that political scientists in particular seem newly attentive to issues of cultural inclusion and representation, or that whole new fields of international law and theory have emerged with names like cultural property and cultural rights. Indeed, these fields, unlike the ones I am more closely connected with, seem to be really grappling with the changing global landscape in which explicit claims to culture hold significant power and meaning. And it is this emerging field of cultural theory which brought me to my current interest in global indigenous studies. But what I'd like really to address here is the issue of culture as a kind of code word for interdisciplinarity, again, because that is, of course, the more apposite topic on the occasion of the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Robert Penn Warren Center and the work it has enabled so many of us to do. And to do that, I'd like to say a few things not only about the past 25 years, but about intellectual life in the American century. In 1959, the radical sociologist C. Wright Mills wrote a cantankerous book called The Sociological Imagination, in which he celebrated a way of thinking that, I'm here quoting Mills, enables its possessor to understand the larger historical scene in terms of its meanings for the inner life and the external career of a variety of individuals. Not very far from this celebration, of course, was a critique of the instrumentalization of mid-20th century social science and its corresponding newfound power and prestige, not as a capacious eye on society, but as a tool of hegemony, of marketing, governance, warfare, and military intelligence, of the social order. And yet Mills was no more optimistic about intellectuals outside of the social sciences, who in retrospect we also see were being incorporated into bureaucratic structures of their own, notably the university and corporate media. Of them, Mills wrote, "What fiction, what journalism, what artistic endeavor can compete with the historical reality and political facts of our time? What dramatic vision of hell can compete with the events of 20th century war? What moral denunciations can measure up to the moral insensibility of men in the agonies of primary accumulation?" If social science had become the bureaucrat's toolkit, Mills worried that literature had become a minor art, inadequate to the job of describing the complexity of contemporary social life. Now, it's my contention that despite whatever cultural turn we may have all experienced in the 1980s and 90s, what Mills described was probably closer to the cultural dominant since World War II. Art has been and continues to be largely separate from social critique and analysis, and the vast majority of intellectual life in one way or another has been institutionally captured and bureaucratically constrained. At its best, then, the cultural turn represented a moment when certain possibilities opened up, which broke down some of these instrumentalizations and reifications of thought, when it seemed possible to complexly understand individuals and collectivities as creative agents of history and society. Put this way, none of us should be too surprised that the cultural turn is now over, not because it was a failure or because it was conceptually flawed, but because it was an oppositional project. mind you, not oppositional in the sense that cultural studies destroyed capitalism, or the new cultural history inspired revolution, but in the sense that in its very interdisciplinarity, it worked in a small way toward complex understanding and against the artificial limits imposed on the work of scholars, students, and other intellectuals. And this is where places like the Robert Penn Warren Center come in, which allow for the open conversations and small experiments in interdisciplinarity that keep thought and imagination of all sorts alive. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Anne Morey, who's Associate Professor of English at Texas A&M University. She's the author of Hollywood Outsiders, the Adaptation of the Film Industry, 1913 to 1934. She's published in Film History, Quarterly Review of Film and Video, Tulsa Studies in Women's Literature, and other journals. She's also published an anthology on Stephanie Meyer's Twilight phenomenon and is presently at work on a treatment of Christian cinema within the American film industry. She's Associate Editor of the Children's Literature Association Quarterly, and she was a visiting professor at the Warren Center in the 2010-2011 seminar on representation and social change. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and I add my thanks to the Warren Center, and I am indeed very grateful to be part of the celebration. I am not myself a theorist, so I may perhaps be a bit of an imposter on a panel titled Culture and Theory. I will admit to doing culture, which I do as an institutional historian of film and media. Since my appointment is in an English department, and because of the new exigencies of higher education, I now teach more literature than was once the case, I thought I would approach the topic of the panel through a kind of excursion through the institutional history of the relationship between the English department and literary theory. As for the periodization we need to consider today, that is, the change in discourse in, of, and perhaps about the humanities over the last 25 years, I offer this way of thinking about the then-now relationship. The then might be represented by Anne Matthews' 1991 Deciphering Victorian Underwear, the first of a long line of annual New York Times culture pieces that delighted in mocking the titles of MLA papers and the outre clothing of the panelists, chosen with an eye to their semiotic possibilities. I will take Stanley Fish's What's Next for Literary Studies, published this month, also in the New York Times, as representative of the now moment. In this piece, Fish assures us that the day of literary theory that we previously associated with a deconstruction black wardrobe has passed, that theory has been domesticated and incorporated in various ways into all sorts of critical labor. As a colleague of mine put it, we all do theory now. Louis Menand and Robert Scholes have offered two very useful accounts of the institutional history of the English department and the place of literary theory within it, which I will attempt to synthesize here. A sense of crisis is not new to English departments, which designed a discrete sequence of steps to deal with the sense of inferiority associated with the teaching of literature in a newly professionalized field, in newly professionalized universities, whose science and technology faculties were better able to realize the benefits of these new institutional structures than were faculty in literature departments. For one thing, as both Menand and John Ellis observe, radically original scholarship in the humanities is harder to produce and perhaps to recognize than it is in the sciences. And one of the consequences of that difference is that theory is useful as a force multiplier for apparent originality in literary criticism. English departments suffered from a kind of science envy, which pushed them to prefer approaches whose rigor could be asserted owing to its obvious difficulty. This effort served the interests of professionalization. Philological inquiry, for example, was seen as more rigorous and scientific than what had preceded it, the Arnoldian examination of the best that has been thought and written, and so on through to deconstruction and postmodernism. The irony of the pursuit of ever more rigorous approaches to literary study is that A, it threatened to cut professors of literature off from the wider culture of cultivated but non-professional readers, hence the lingerie mockery of the times. B, cut scholars off from the history of their own discipline as one theoretical paradigm was replaced by the next. And C, proved in the end unsustainable, effort and stakes notwithstanding. One of the functions of professionalized literary study was the replacement of taste with something that appeared less personal and consequently more scientific. This was the great triumph of Northrop Frye's Anatomy of Criticism, which firmly repudiated Arnoldian categories by observing that his social judgments were masquerading as literary ones. Nonetheless, what permitted professional literary study in the first place was the insistence that the literary text was unique and thus subject to approaches that must be taught and that therefore can be professionalized, kept safely away from the marketplace in a department with firm boundaries. Even for the rigorous, then, utility wasn't the aim. The insistence that the literary text is a unique form of communication was, of course, itself later abandoned precisely through the efforts of theorists who saw that Batman comics and Moby Dick can both be read productively through allied approaches, thereby extending interpretive techniques to the kinds of texts that were previously thought unworthy of interpretation. The consequence of discovering the fungibility of texts before particular critical approaches has been the blurring of disciplinary boundaries. As Menand puts it, deconstruction was the end of the line for disciplinarity. Hostile critics such as Alan Bloom raged over the loss of a hierarchy of literary value and the abandonment of a canon. To make matters worse for the champions of theory, the so-called affair of 1996 made it plain that while literary theorists no longer apparently cared for scientific rigor, as scientists saw it, they cared very much for their prerogatives as professionals, since it was on that basis that so-called hoax essay was accepted by social texts. Misgivings about it were overlooked because the source was both properly credentialed and evidently, though not actually, sympathetic to the project of the journal. By the early 1990s, then, we arrived at the moment at which Menand, following upon an observation by David Bromwich, describes literary theory as both hard and ironic. Hard because of its emphasis on theoretical rigor, and ironic because it denies the possibility of objective knowledge. Science envy may have pushed the humanities to this position, but the question is how to get out of this impasse. It is clear that several current favorites for addressing the problem amount to theorizing the hair of the dog that bit you. So, for example, the cure for the loss of administrative clout attendant upon the blurring of disciplinary boundaries is to turn increasingly to inter- or transdisciplinary work in the humanities, an approach championed by Gerald Graff, Sander Gilman, and Michael Berube, even though, as Lynn Hunt has observed, that big tent approach may make it easier for deans to consolidate or close departments. Very point you made. Likewise, the cure for too much literary criticism as ersatz science is, for some of us at least, more science, as witnessed by the rise of literary Darwinism on the one hand, in which evolutionary psychology is used to explore our consumption of narrative, and the popularity of digital humanities on the other, in which the technology associated with computer science becomes the means for reshaping or augmenting the discipline, making for a kind of bionic humanities. And I will add, it is fascinating to see in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences report the idea that the Enlightenment is one predecessor for the current moment of big data, a thing we might want to think about. Digital humanities has the distinction, if you like Fish's prognostications, of being the next big thing in literary study, per his reading of the 2014 MLA conference schedule. The desire to reassert what Menand calls the scientistic bona fides of English may also explain the recent return to philology, although, as Jeffrey Hart-Harpman explains, there are virtually no departments of philology in the United States, and philological journals publish the same kinds of criticism otherwise appearing in non-philological journals, which makes this phenomenon more like a dream of origin than a vital new approach. On the principle that everything old is new again, Fish also notes the perdurable interest in religion at the upcoming MLA. Scholz's account of the place of religion in literary study is to present it as the secret sharer in the movement towards a more scientific discipline. Religion represents both what is cast out overtly in the secularization of the university and what cannot be removed, in the end, from the literary enterprise. Not only does it lurk in our notions of the canon, whether we are for or against such a thing, but it also lurks in our desire to convert our students to the life of the mind, or to critical thinking, or to a love of Tennyson, the model of the professor as evangelist, if you will. And of course, it's also in the model of the professor as a creator or enforcer of our orthodoxy. But Scholz's account of literary theory tantalizingly traces a thread of religious preoccupation outside of curriculum or classroom, in the very theory that critics use to analyze texts, running from the New Critics to Yale deconstructionism. Following John Guillory's argument, Scholz observes that ambiguity was prized by the New Critics because it prevents the work from being placed at the disposal of practical aims, replacing doxa with paradox. Meanwhile, for the Yale deconstructionists, in Scholz's phrase, great books are those that deconstruct themselves most fully, making the ethics of reading an act of endless expiation for an original sin of difference from which no redeemer will save us. What both approaches share is a refusal to let a narrowly defined utility be the aim of the enterprise. To reject utility is dangerous in the current political economy of the academy, but so is to assert that the humanities are predictably and immediately useful. Yet it would seem that utility, as opposed to the basic black deconstruction outfit, is the major defense our institutional representatives currently offer to our critics. Published this spring, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences report on the humanities and social sciences, The Heart of the Matter, seems to acknowledge that at best the humanities are the handmaidens of enterprises, commercial, military, or technical. For example, the document suggests that knowing more than one language staves off Alzheimer's, or that more tellingly, our foreign wars might go more smoothly had we more young people adept at foreign languages. Well, yes, one might say, but had we more young people steeped in foreign literatures, or even in their own, which is increasingly being perceived as foreign by our students, we might have more informed discussions about how and why and whether to go to war at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. Our third speaker is Arcadi Platnitsky, who's professor of English and theory at Purdue University, where he's the director of the Theory and Cultural Studies program and a member of the Philosophy and Literature program. He's published extensively on continental philosophy, philosophy of physics and mathematics, Romanticism, modernism, and the relationships among literature, philosophy, and science. Among his many publications are Niels Bohr and Complementarity and Epistemology and Probability. He's currently at work on two book projects. He was the Warren Center Visiting Fellow in 1994-95 for the Seminar on Science and Society. Arkady.
Thank you. As it happened, I was the first fellow at the center, and I am immensely grateful not only for wonderful things which I learned, but to all the people, some of whom are right here. Mark, John, and Paul Friedman was the director, of course, and although Jake Layton was not officially a member of the seminar, but I think I had wonderful interactions with him as a fellow romanticist. My English field is British Romanticism, and I just tell you that contrary to appearances, I'm also an English professor at the so it was absolutely wonderful experience, and I don't have prepared remarks. The reason for that is, for which I apologize, the reason for that is that changed what I wanted to say in view of the composition of all these panels, because I'm somewhat of an oddball in the sense that that seminar was Science and Society, and I'm going to speak about these connections, which is almost the only paper on that subject. It's not that science is not present in these discussions, but it's somewhat different, and I shall comment on that momentarily. I want to locate two major changes which took place in last 20 years. These changes started to emerge when this seminar took place at the time. But they now really developed significantly. One of them concerns culture or society, and the other one concerns science itself. And that is probably will be much less known to some of you here. The change which concerns culture is that the dominant science and culture these days is no longer fundamental physics, which it was for so long. Two dominant sciences in our culture and society are biology in its various manifestations and information theory, or the areas where they come together. Indeed, the emergence of a field like quantum information science, to which I made actually some contributions, is itself a reflection on this type of situation. And that change is really quite radical with respect to the relationships between humanities and sciences, and I'll comment on that momentarily. My next sort of appointment, similar to Warren Center, was actually at the Kavli Institute for Neuroscience at Columbia University. Purdue paid for that, actually, not Kavli, but a few years back, and that was a really astounding experience, because neuroscience now is where physics was at the time of before Galileo, and we can see how pervasive it is in our discussion, including here. It was everywhere in some of these talks here, including in Anne's talks, as you just mentioned. And the second change, which is really quite subtle, you would only see it if you go to conferences, as I do, on physics, where you deal with physicists rather than with humanists. And that has to do with our sense of understanding what science can prove in an experiment. And you can see now versus even 10, 15 years ago that when experimental scientists talk about their findings and results, at least half of the talk is directed to qualification concerning the fact to what degree this result is not proof. That is to say, what are the loopholes, what are the possible caveat, etc. In fact, you no longer ever hear anything in a science conference when the scientist would say, we proved something in an experiment. It would always be a statement of the type that the experiment tells us that this is the plausible outcome. That's why actually they don't quite yet in a constructive paradigm of assessing the experiment, but it comes close. And in fact, I remember quite well, as part of this seminar in which Science and Society, Gisela Mosik, who died, and this talk could be dedicated to her memory, mentioned the Genome Project from the very critical perspective in sort of how it's conducted, how it's put together. That's why it was quite remarkable that I've heard in Professor Firik's paper. She was brilliantly exposing the constructive nature of race, and yet she said that the science proves that race is a meaningful category, right? In the sense that there is a constructivism to Genome Project. I think the way I would put it, it would go like that. The Genome Project and other biological or genetic projects show no evidence that race is anything as a constructed, but something constructed. If you ask me how likely it is going to prove otherwise, I would say very unlikely. But that's all what science does, right? In a certain sense, science is a project of plausible reasoning, right? To one degree or another, it confirms our expectation concerning these things. And that's really a significant change, which you can only see in experimental physics discussion, because obviously in the popular domain, and even in literary studies, this scientific paradigm is still enters that, even though we ought to know better. However, I think that neuroscience and biology do provide a new ground to some degree for the humanities, not in a sense of adopting that in that way that we become scientific, will prove it, etc. But on the contrary, one of the reasons for that, the neuroscience, all science is radically interdisciplinary. We don't realize, for example, to what degree the founders of quantum theory were also chemists. But this science has always been related to humanistic discipline, psychology, and even psychoanalysis, which enjoys now a greater recognition in neuroscience than in experimental psychology, which is an interesting fact in itself, including Freud, right? It was virtually taboo in experimental psychology department, but not in neuroscience. And Freud, of course, started as a neuroscientist. A big loss for neuroscience that he left it behind. And I think it is in that field we can really see the reverse movement, or rather the reciprocal movement between the more humanistic ways of inquiry and more scientific ways of inquiry, which exposes the complexity of how these things operate. And I have no time, of course, here to even minimally touch upon that. And where it provides a kind of paradigm in which we can see it as happening in science itself. But unfortunately, to appreciate it, we have to really see the science and operation a little bit more. It's not that actually physics completely disappears either, because my most recent appointment was in the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics. And the paper which is coming out in International Journal of Theoretical Physics is actually an application of the mathematics of quantum theory to cognitive psychology and economics. The reason I mention here somewhat modestly, I hope you'll forgive me, is that what this paper argues against is a critique of the rational-based econometrics, which presumes that our economic decisions are based in terms of maximizing profit, doing all these things, etc. So that is to say, I think there is an enormous space for using a deeper level of the humanistic, of the analysis which we pursue in humanistic fields, including in fields like deconstruction, which unfortunately Schultz caricatured to almost an unacceptable degree. Forgive me for saying that, but it is really there, in my view, where the future of the humanities lies for those of us who are interested in that type of future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arkady. Our fourth speaker is Maurice Stevens, who's Associate Professor of Comparative Studies at Ohio State University, where he teaches interdisciplinary cultural and technological studies. His most recent research is focused on the emergence and application of trauma theory in clinical, social, and institutional contexts. In addition to publishing nearly a dozen articles and guest editing a number of the journal Oppositional Conversations, Professor Stevens has published his first book, Troubled Beginnings, Transperforming African American History and Identity, and he's currently working on a second book called From the Past Imperfect Towards a Critical Trauma Theory. He was the visiting fellow in 2008-2009 for the seminar, Logically, New Directions in Trauma Studies. Maurice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'll begin by doing the mic check. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. And by quickly thanking Ed and Mona. I don't know where you are now. Hi. And of course the Robert Penn Warren Center, as we all have so far, and really as we all must, right? Because that's why we're here, but I think it was deeply transformational for many of us. And thanking you, for the, not just the space, but really the generosity. That's something I felt really, the kind of generosity of spirit and an environment of authentic welcome that created, I think, and set the stage for the possibility for the interdisciplinary work that happened in our group, and probably happened in many other groups, to really be deeply stimulating and the sort of authentic intellectual engagement. It required a kind of willingness to be vulnerable, I think, that we all opened up to, and was greatly generative. So I'm deeply appreciative for that. And also gratitude for having been invited back to be part of this conversation here, to engage in the conversation about the humanities, but also to connect with some fantastic colleagues. And hopefully we'll be doing more of that and actually having more dialogue. So thank you. And I built those thanks into my 10 minutes. So you don't have to start. Yeah. So I'm going to keep my comments pretty short today because I really think the value of our being here will be emergent in our conversation. I'm certain that the best of what we can do here together and know together as a group will come from those conversations and the ways that we kind of can challenge, hopefully, and spark each other into, through dialogue, into I don't know, new places as opposed to sort of just a unidirectional delivery of information. So I'm going to get through this as quickly as possible. And also, because I'm someone for whom the place of theory and culture within the humanities has been central through my academic career, and because I think sharing, as I'm going to, will hopefully kind of enact in some ways precisely what I think I've learned to this point about the question of what's been the place and the role of theory and culture in the humanities over the past couple decades. I'm going to actually try to situate it, my comments anyway, in a reflection on my formation as a scholar in the humanities and qualitative social sciences over what's been nearly 25 years now. And so when which for me wasn't that long ago, when I first started thinking about what I'd say today, I associated, I had a memory, I actually told someone yesterday, I had a memory come to me that I hadn't had in probably 20 years, this memory, or almost 20 years. And what I remembered was a conference that I attended while I was an undergraduate. I was majoring in religion and anthropology at Princeton, and I attended this conference that was taking place there. I was probably a junior, maybe a sophomore at the time. So it was, this was in the late 80s. And the culture wars were raging in the academy at the time, and there was sort of a debate that was breaking out at this conference, which the conference featured Dinesh D'Souza, among others. It was a kind of canon wars conference at Princeton, leading edge, and the conversations were kind of emerging at this confluence of streams of thought, like Bloom's Closing of the American Mind and Cheney's report on the humanities in America. And I remember this contestations about Rigoberta Menchu's I, Rigoberta at the time. Is it, should it be included in the canon or not? And so it was being hotly contested at the time. And as I remember it now, I was a little junior or sophomore. It felt that there was a kind of sense that the humanities were somehow under attack or in some kind of a state of crisis at that point, questioning relevance and futures. And to hear the D'Souza's and Cheney's and Bloom's tell it, the humanities were kind of guilty of pulling the great Western universals of art and philosophy into the muck of particularism and sullying them with the politics based in race and gender and ideology that would later kind of come to be called standpoint theory from a different perspective. And the intensities of these debates, even then, really couldn't be overlooked. It was palpable, literally, physically palpable for me. And many of the panels that I attended across those 2 days ended up in these heated, shouting matches between people who felt that there are some very deep things at stake. And for me, seeing my usually kind of staid and self-composed professors, shake with exasperation or, stumble over their words in frustration, it was fascinating to me. I was hooked, for sure. Graduate school, here I come. And even more importantly, I was convinced that important conversations, meaningful conversations, were actually taking place, which I hadn't been entirely convinced of to that point. And that academia could be a place where these conversations could happen, and that by attending graduate school, that I could actually figure out what some of those conversations were, and that I might even contribute to them, or at the very least, I could get in a fight with Arkady up here. So by the time I was considering graduate programs in the early 90s, scholars that were kind of hostile to the place of theory, this is my sense, this is from my perspective as an unfolding scholar, it seemed that scholars who were hostile to the place of theory that it was coming to occupy in the humanities, that they were arguing that by destabilizing some sense of assumed fixity of the meaning in texts, these theories privileged a kind of performance among academics of a kind of theoretical savvy or mastery, right? That it was all about what was on the surface. And the critics argued that this kind of resulted in academic work being judged on its superficial features, with value being placed on, on how well you could play with the jargon, or what kind of lexical sleight of hand you could bring to bear, or what fancy theoretical moves you might be able to make, instead of being measured by the merits of the content, the content of its character. So I remember talking, actually, as a kind of way to tell it, with another student, and I started the History of Consciousness PhD program, and I was talking to another grad student there who had just started, or who had been there for a couple years, who shared with me this joke, the following joke that had been circulating among undergraduates who were taking courses in the department. And it was, what do you get when you cross a History of Consciousness graduate student with a mafia boss? And I don't know, what do you get? And they're, it's an offer you cannot understand. Right? This was the humor that was circulating among the undergrad students who were taking comp-sci courses, right? So there was this sense that that's what it meant to be, highly theoretical, and so the critiques were standing. But by the end of my first year, I actually understood the joke, and by the end of my third year, I'd forgotten it entirely. So the fact that sort of these new theories challenge foundational beliefs about the production of knowledge and the theoretical assumptions that made the known emerge in particular ways at specific moments, complexly contextualized in history and under particular conditions of possibility, the fact of that challenge, right, made theory a target for the more kind of scientifically minded or folks who were representing themselves as scientifically minded members of the humanities. Theory's detractors decried its circular logic and found the use of concepts from multiple disciplinary locations to be shallow at best and mercenary at worst. Indeed, some deemed theory cultish and marked, by these unintelligible stars who would run around with, graduate student acolytes circling around them and kind of orbiting devotees who would police and defend the boundaries of theory's right application. And so by the time I kind of entered and got settled into graduate school over the years of the 90s, early years of the 90s, theory had kind of been joined by a form of critical theory that was informed by identitarian politics, right? Things like race, positional politics, race, class, gender, sexuality, and a very powerful and what I experienced at the time kind of liberating image of the kind of subaltern speaking back from colonial and academic margins and back into the center and having a kind of moral authority that went with intellectual production. So on the one hand, theory was being seen as abstracting social relations and thereby rendering itself socially irrelevant. And then on the other, theory was imagined to be overly particular and allowing political concerns to kind of displace the pure interests in aesthetics or intellectual acumen. Right? So I ended up spending the next 8 years, and I was one of the first people to complete first few, but so the norm was actually 10 years at the time I was in this program, which is saying something about the place of history and culture in there anyway at that time. So I ended up spending the next 8 years at HISCON, a program initiated by, incidentally, by students who wanted to connect their academic knowledge production with their embodied political engagement and community. I spent those years watching people like Hayden White, James Clifford, Angela Davis, Donna Haraway, Teresa de Loretas all ask these tough questions of their origin disciplines of history, anthropology, philosophy, biology, and literature, respectively. And they were asking these tough questions, so these were the folks I was watching, learning what it meant to be an academic, asked tough questions about the foundations of the disciplines at the margins of which they stood. And by their examples, I came to believe that doing theory in the academy, so what it was meaning for me at the time, had something to do with having the courage to ask oneself really tough questions about one's own intellectual formation and academic activity, to ask what it is we're actually doing in the academy. Questions for which we don't already have answers, or questions that disturb us when we ask them. And it was around this time, too, that British cultural studies, which had been really kind of enjoying a robust emergence, came to the U.S. and Jim Clifford had connections with Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy, and so those were the folks who were kind of the stars at the time who were bringing cultural studies to the academic scene in the U.S. during this period. And I experienced it in that context, I began challenging the kind of strict boundaries between high and low culture, taking up these kind of nuanced analyses of culture and social practices that were both thoroughly theoretically grounded in specific experiences, right? So theoretically grounded and located in specific experiences. Theory was no longer a bad word. It didn't have to connote an abstraction of real material relations between people and institutions, or an escape into some kind of ivory tower of privilege, or an alibi for representing one's labor as apolitical. No longer, for me anyway, was theory in the humanities considered a sign of the over-specialization of academic discourse or the professionalization of academic workers, or even a focus on method at the expense of content. The interdisciplinary context of that department offered a really rich soil for the kind of nuanced theoretical and cultural analyses that cultural studies was calling for. So it shifted things for me. So thinking culture and thinking theory together became something new, but it was in the context of interdisciplinarity, right? Being named that way. So I want to suggest that the emergence of interdisciplinarity itself is a kind of important occurrence that marks a shift in the practice of knowledge production in the academy, while also feeding into these kind of significant changes in academic funding models, right, and organizational processes. So from a theoretical perspective, interdisciplinarity offered one kind of answer to critiques being leveled at the humanities. For example, multidisciplinary engagement with a topic brought faculty together, and this happened in my experience with the Warren Center as well. It brought faculty together across chasms of difference. It got them around all those constraints produced by the perception of their overspecialization that theory had been confirmed before. It was true not only because collaboration and dialogue allowed for translation of one specialization into the lexicon of another, thereby rendering it meaningful or at least legible in new fields of study, but it also relieved this kind of overspecialization by bringing disparate fields into conversation with one another in ways that substantially transformed them, right? Or at least substantially transformed the work of individual scholars. Indeed, my experience of the History of Consciousness program was that all graduate students arriving there with a master's, which meant 10 of the 12 folks in my cohort anyway, had the experience of watching their projects dissolve in this kind of swirling confluence, because they were coming from disciplines, and then they were in this interdisciplinary setting, and then everybody lost their project over the first year, and then had to rebuild, or most people had to rebuild it. But it resulted from our having been brought into that space. So monodisciplinary projects were forced to examine and interrogate the assumptions that made them possible or even necessary. And I know this kind of experience I had while here at the Penn Center, and I imagine that it was true for many of you as well, that your projects underwent some kind of substantive transformation because of their encounter with other folks and other ideas. I'm just about finished here. And I'm finding that for me anyway, this is still the case in interdisciplinary contexts. I'm in an interdisciplinary program now. And that it's evident that what critical race theory demands of feminism, or what queer of color reflections require of critical race theory, or what disability studies questions in queer of color theorizing, or what settler colonial critiques ask of, this ongoing encounter with the challenging discourse has been, generative. So because these analytical frameworks deeply intersect with one another, it's easy to imagine the richness of the new frameworks that emerge from this kind of crucible of interdisciplinarity. And what's been particularly fulfilling for me as an interdisciplinary scholar in the 90s and into the 2000s to now is the sense that engaging in interdisciplinary and intersectional scholarship means theorizing in very serious and rigorous ways. There's a political piece for me. And taking cultural production and cultural performance very seriously is not only a legitimate object of study, but as a necessary one as well. And it's meant making an effort to ask what kinds of assumptions undergird the humanist tradition and engage in a kind of ideological critique of the claim of objective and kind of disinterested knowledge made by the humanities, even while being situated firmly within them, right? So self-critique. Theory and culture in the humanities has become, for me, as an interdisciplinary scholar, a call and a means to respond to the contemporary scene in meaningful ways, a call and a means to bring my theoretical work into the world as cultural work that can produce understandings of, perhaps larger scale historical political projects that confront our knowledge making and our teaching in the humanities. I'll also add that at this particular moment, for me anyway, taking theory and culture seriously means generating questions that we must ask ourselves and our institutions. And to end, I'm just going to throw two questions out there. I don't feel like we need to take them up, but they are important to me. And one has been, I don't know, maybe this is just a provocation. One shall be, when shall we stop kind of machinically producing graduate students for a shrinking market, when we know very well that this kind of undermines the integrity of our work as educators, our labor as educators? And then also under what, and so I don't have an answer for that question, I'm just putting it out there. And under what circumstances will we begin responding with outrage to the brazen, literal devaluing of the work that we do and the erosion of our economic and financial base? And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all four of you for your engaging comments, and we do have time to open the dialogue. So, yes.
I'm the youngest of 6 kids, so I tend not to need a microphone to be heard, but thank you. My question is maybe also a bit of a provocation, but it's something I think about a lot, and so I'm not going to suggest I have an answer. And I think it's triggered mainly from Anne's talk, although I think Susan hit on some of these issues too, and I'd be happy to hear any of the panel discuss this. And the question is there anyone willing to speak in defense of the utility argument for justifying the humanities? My anxiety when people say, I'm tired of having to prove how the humanities are useful, how it can get our students jobs, yada, yada. My anxiety is that in criticizing the utility argument, we are in fact ceding the ground of utility itself to bureaucrats and a kind of administrative institutional mindset. And coming from my training in the field of rhetoric, the harlot of the arts, which is valued and devalued simultaneously for its artful utility, this is a disciplinary question for me, but I think it hits at a broader set of concerns. So I'd be happy to hear people either speak in defense of utility or in defense of taking utility back.
If I may begin to respond to that, one of the things I have been thinking about as I wrote these remarks was, in fact, the 1919 version of Marianne Moore's poetry, which, of course, asserts both the usefulness and the uselessness of poetry and concludes with the imaginary gardens with real toads in them. And to qualify my remarks, in case they were subject to misapprehension, it is not that the humanities are useless. It is that I think we paint ourselves into a corner by cooperating with people who want to define them in precise, short-term terms. In other words, for the use of the humanities, I think we have to have a kind of suspension of expectation of a particular result. And one of the things that puzzles me is the relationship, and maybe rhetoric is going to be illuminating in this regard, between the content of our disciplines and the technique associated with them. For example, the best arguments made in The Heart of the Matter have to do with the transferability of technique. We need people who can read, we need people who can write, we need people who can speak Arabic. Speaking Arabic being, of course, a technical skill in this case, which is, of course, true. We do need that. And in the classroom, that is certainly one of the things we teach. But what is left open and disputed is the value of the content. That is to say, do we have to insist that you will remember King Lear and remember a set of attitudes about King Lear? Or is it enough that you've now read King Lear and can probably read some other things too? So what do we do with that relationship? And should we worry about it at all? And of course it is, I will add, content that divides us, disciplinarily speaking, more than it probably unites us. In other words, one of the ways of characterizing the past 25 years is to say that our approach methodologically or theoretically is much more convergent probably than it was in the preceding 25 or 50 years. So I don't know whether that really addresses your question or not, but.
The other.
Just a couple of thoughts. I think the question of utility, well, it brings up a couple of things for me. One is that, as I alluded to in my paper, I don't actually think, at least from my own experience at my institution, that administrators really care. Like their mindset is on, you know, student contact hours and all that other kind of stuff, and whether we come up with the perfect definition of what we're doing that really, you know, enables good things for our students or for the world doesn't matter. The other, that's just my sense of it. My other obsession in regard to this issue is that I wish that people in the humanities had a little bit more robust combination about how dangerous the humanities is. Because I think really some of what we're trying to do when we talk about our utility is in fact to reassure people that we're not as dangerous as all that. And I have a very interesting colleague who's done some rather terrifying research on right-wing think tanks and their strategies for, in fact, kind of defanging the academic humanities. And they discovered in the culture wars that that strategy of kind of attacking them head on as a kind of ideological project, saying that we were all a bunch of tenured radicals, et cetera, didn't actually work. But boy, it really, you know, does the trick if you defund departments, right? And this is not, this is, and so it sounds like a conspiracy theory that I'm giving you, but my colleague Kim Emery has found the documents that basically show that this is a strategy that is circulated throughout upper echelons of administrations that are worried about, one, handling the problem of ideological conflicts with faculty members and conservative politicians, and two, are worried about obstreperous faculty members insisting on things like shared governance. Because if you haven't noticed, a lot of the people who are most obnoxious to the upper administrations tend to come from humanities and social science departments. So utility, maybe we should confront the issue and talk about why we are dangerous and threatening and teaching scary skills to our students like critical thinking that is not going to do them well if they do it right in law school. It is in fact going to upset things in all kinds of unpredictable ways. Maybe we should be talking about that.
Just very brief remark. I mean, the problem you have is the concept of utility itself. It is really difficult to convince the opposite sides about the complexity of the idea of utility. I mean, this debate is important even in fundamental science. I mean, look, I mean, the superconductor, supercollider was shot 20 years ago on these grounds of the lack of utility, although scientists try, but they don't have our or your rhetorical skills to convince the senators into the. So I think it's. I think that's the idea of utility is a problem, including the as part of counter-utility to explain the utilitarian functions of being dangerous is extremely hard, but it carries important utilitarian functions when you need to change or reform something. That's why in science, political support is really problematic because the political structures change every 4 years, but any meaningful scientific project can take 10 years to develop, and you don't know where it's going to end up. So I think that is even there, and certainly I think that's where the real problem is. It's not really, I think, as both and Susan said, I mean, you really, it's not that they're useless. I mean, what they're useful for, or what is the utility for, and unfortunately it's confrontational because there are all manner of other things which don't think that they see that utility itself as dangerous. It's not really, it's not useful. You can say that the problem is the utility of the humanities, if you think about utility careful, not their uselessness. I think they wouldn't care about uselessness. They care about utility of a certain type. Yeah, that's just.
John?
Yes, well, I want to thank all four panelists for stimulating presentations. Each time I thought, this is great, no one's going to be able to top that. And the next person topped it. So what I want to do
I
is
win. That's not what you meant.
So this means you can respond then, Maurice, to the question that I'm going to try to formulate. And that has to do with, I'm sort of still responding myself to the question posed about utility. And I thought to myself, well, heavens, for years I've always told people, what do? I seed projects. And of course they look at me, what do you mean you seed projects? You mean like in the natural sciences? You get money and then you investigate something and you take it from there? I said, no. I am a cultivator. This is what culture is all about. What kind of a garden do I want to cultivate? Well, what's the soil like? The soil composition. If I know what the soil is like, I will know what kind of plants will grow there, fauna, whatnot. What do I have to do to the plot of ground that I have in order to make sure that there's a kind of ecological diversity which will withstand all kinds of external influences on that plot of ground? So that's a metaphor for the human mind. And so what I as a humanist have done, and I think we all do this, is we try to tap into the potential that is in each individual's cranium and see what can come out of it. therefore I also said, you know, we have been misspelling the canon for ages. It should be spelled with two N's. Because the genuine work of canonical art or literature or philosophy is one that constantly challenges. And so I want to switch now and go to my question.
Yeah, okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, the question is, I sense a couple of discourses going on. The utility one is aimed at the outside world, aimed at administrators. What I would like to explore a little bit further is, have you explored, is there a difference in the way that we understand interdisciplinary collaboration or interdisciplinary approaches in our individual work? Is there a kind of surface interdisciplinarity? We pick up on certain paradigms, we pick up on certain language, and a kind of deep structure interdisciplinary collaboration, which is, of course, hard to do in my mind.
Thank you. Maurice, why don't you start?
Well, since I volunteered myself to start off on and this, you know, this question, because so at the History of Consciousness department, this was a kind of almost an obsession for the graduate students, as we were trying, like most, to figure out what it was that we were being disciplined into in an interdisciplinary department. So we'd have these long, arguments about whether or not work X was adisciplinary or multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, adisciplinary, and how you define that. So we were developing our own rules around it, and I would say that the way that, say, interdisciplinary scholarship is being articulated at my big Research One institution, where it's something that's being touted as that's where the money's going, actually, and so that the argument for utility there is not is really one of directed towards the scientists. Consider us relevant enough and important, useful enough to include us in your grants. But there, it's definitely a different kind of it's more of a multidisciplinary. You bring together a number of people to talk about a particular problem, and it's not necessarily the way I think of interdisciplinarity, or at least the idealized form for me is when these frameworks come together in such a way that they bring each other to crisis and require the emergence of something completely different. Right? And that's not a superficial, I don't know, multicultural, in a multicultural sense of interdisciplinarity. Right? It's not about just bringing different methods together, but about a substantive change in how you're looking.
Other, please.
Yeah, John, of course, the deep, what you call the deeper interdisciplinarity is extremely difficult because it requires a kind of knowledge which is not maybe necessarily equal to the field with which you want to interact, but it's sufficient to do something. And that's really to do also with reconsideration of the idea of what constitutes the foundations of any given discipline. We used to think about foundations as something like reductive, while now we have a much more complex sense of what constitutes foundations. I'll give you an example from the field of history of mathematics, which is still true. The foundations of mathematics usually have to do with logic. It's a very Aristotelian view of mathematics, that it's a very refined form of logic. Bertrand Russell and Frege were all these people. But of course, that's just not true, because any mathematician, thoughtful mathematician, will tell you that logic will never explain to you why some equations are important and others are not. And that is the kind of indication in which the conceptual, and that was part of our seminar, 19 years ago, about the kind of very different understanding of mathematics, including its kind of cultural dimension. I think one of the things to what degree you bring what could appear as surface in this interdisciplinarity, but in fact it is not, because certain things could be used as jargon or they could be used as reflecting deeper concept. If you take all the usual French suspects, you know, like Deleuze, Derrida, etc., it is of course true that Badiou, more recently, that their terms would be circulating by any number of people, and unfortunately, there is that tendency to always judge in the interdisciplinary work by the worst examples and say, look how bad it is. And while on the other hand, there are, of course, a very good, deep example of this type of work. And scientists are, of course, reasonably suspicious about bringing humanistic, even though we know very well that all the major founding figures of physics were actually pretty deeply steeped in humanistic knowledge, right? And they, I mean, Einstein was a reader of Dostoevsky, Bohr, Heisenberg, whose father was a classics professor, and he discovered quantum mechanics while reading Plato's Timaeus. I mean, that's a fact, you know. It's an empirical fact. Well, obviously, I constructed too, but so in a way, you know, there is that really, you know, in a certain sense, it's not always clear, John, whether by judge from outside whether something surface or something deep. From the inside, we might know, but the deep interdisciplinarity requires a lot of work and a lot of cooperation in which you really can talk about understanding these ideas. It's perfectly possible, but the institutional structures don't always encourage that, including in terms of funding.
Other comments? Charles, please.
I'd like to look at this issue of the utility of the humanities slightly at a different angle, which is not intended to challenge anything that's been said. My guess is that Robert Penn Warren did not give a fig about the utility of what he was doing. I would say that's true of most poets, and it's most true of a lot of people who are very creative people that we teach. There is a side to the humanities that should have no interest in whatsoever, precisely in order to be useful to that aspect of being human that most other aspects don't see. So I want to bracket for a moment utility and say, sure, I've done my share of talking about the importance of knowing philosophy for law or for other kinds of practices, but I hope there will be room for us also to appreciate the heritage of Robert Penn Warren and not care about the utility because something of what we do is creative or is beautiful or it's intrinsically valuable.
I'll just observe there is a pie chart in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences report that really kind of terrifies me. It is a representation of responses to the question, is a liberal arts education valuable? And apparently the question was broken into two halves. Would you recommend this to your children? Yes, say 75% of the employers or business owners being asked. Would you recommend this to your workers? Yes, say 50% of the same population. And that is a very provocative image. Is this not being recommended to the workers because it's just decorative and we're not going to lavish that kind of money on self-cultivation? Or is this precisely because of the humanities are dangerous, and this is the difference, in fact, between the worker and the citizen? That is to say, we don't want to fit you to be compliant to a corporation. We want you, in fact, to be able to think with all that that means. So it's so interesting because the problem is both aesthetic and political, and utility speaks to both the aesthetic and the political on both sides of the phenomenon.
Oh, I think, you know, the difficulty is defining these terms. On the one hand, you said it has no utilitarian value, then said, and at the same time is intrinsically useful. I mean, useful carries, I mean, we have to really to be quite careful in making, not obviously here we're still in conversation and it's perfectly fine remarks, but I think they reflect the complexity of these things, because you brought in usefulness in some fashion, which is not exactly the same in utility, obviously, but you mean that they're different in some ways, but we need to explain these terms. Why is that something could be useful and has no utility whatsoever, right? So that is not a, it's a complicated statement, I would say.
And I find myself right now also thinking about the work that we do, much of which is in the classroom with students, and I know I'm constantly trying to, the life of the mind, and there's, where's your passion, and find your passion, and this is the first year where the students who are first-year students coming into university have had, all of their years of education since No Child Left Behind, and they have they've been produced as a particular kind of learner. And that's not an argument for presenting the utility of what, but that piece of the work that we do is in this picture as well. We're laboring in the classroom.
I think we're, yes, oh, please. I'm
Just
sorry.
a direct question to
Right in front of me.
I
Here's
find this,
Tyler with the...
excuse me. A direct question to Susan. I find this labeling of dangers great, and John's contribution to, one shouldn't say canon, but canon with
Yes.
double N is very good. And my question is, and since Anne brought up the fact that parents telling or asking, would you give your children to the humanities to some extent? This is one thing that is answered in a personal and in a sort of liberal arts tradition way in this country. The other is actually, and that's back to my question to Susan, how can you translate the dangerousness into fundraising? Into the sponsoring of the humanities.
Well, you absolutely can't. I mean, what I'm saying when I talk about the danger of the humanities is precisely its irreducibility to the kinds of instrumentalizations that I was talking about that are part of the neoliberal university. The instant we start talking about its relevance to fundraising or its relevance to anything else, the jig is up. But I do think we have parents too. I mean, we have many constituencies here, and we do have parents. And I hold open the firm belief that many of us who are thinking about college have deeply utopian feelings about what college means and wish them for our children. And we have deeply utopian feelings for what the humanities can do for society. And I think it's those non-instrumental feelings that are maybe where we should be addressing our attention and saying, where are new ideas about a better world, a more fulfilled human being going to come from?
Can you translate it into fundraising, into monies?
Categorically, no.
We don't have to translate it, but I think that there's a lot of either or going on here.
Yeah.
Either it's useless or it's utilitarian. I think we have to defend the uselessness of what we do, and at the very same time, we have to fight for resources,
Absolutely.
not just fundraising, but for resources from the state that will protect that uselessness.
Right.
And so I think that this dichotomy and this kind of either-or thinking is something we need to move past. I think I'll say something more about utilitarianism because I've got the floor for 10 minutes this afternoon. So.
But for what it's worth, I want to underline what you just said, Richard. I mean, that's absolutely true. I'm not suggesting when we talk about the danger of the humanities that this is the only approach, because we have multiple constituencies. And this, for all of us who are feeling imperiled, down to our very bones, this is a moment for strategy and not for beautiful souls.
I'd like to give the last word to I believe that the lady in the back had a comment, if I could, and stay if you will, because we'd like to invite you all for lunch, so I want you to hear that lunch invitation.
I just wanted to add that as I sat here and listened, I was thinking about my classes yesterday, I teach history in African American and Diaspora Studies, an interdisciplinary department. I had to teach my students what it meant to be an African slave in the hull of a slave ship for 8 months, in the ship called the Diligent, coming from leaving San Tome on the second leg of the voyage after leaving the French city of Vannes. And I took them into the hold of that ship, knowing how shocking it was going to be to these tender ears. And I didn't pull any punches about what happened in the hold of that ship. But I was also prepared by reading. They're going to read a book about law in slavery. I was also prepared for the psychological impact of what they were going to hear and read. And I needed to be prepared for that. Fortunately, I'm married to a psychologist, and I'd had several conversations with him about trauma. And it was the students that raised the question of mental health in my history class. And I am preparing them to read a novel by Marlon James called The Book of Night Women. And it's one of the roughest novels and one of the most brilliant novels I've ever read. Other students who've read it loved it. Most of these students are not humanities majors. They're engineering, math, across the university. There are 30 of them in my class. My objective is to try and train students to be a particular kind of human being for the future. In the previous class to that, I left my students ready to talk about Slavery by Another Name by Doug Blackman, which is a testimony to the comment made about humanists being dangerous. Because when you read Doug Blackman, you have to critique the corporate structure right through the 20th century. So I don't know if I doubt if anybody's going to give me money to do this, except my paycheck at Vanderbilt where I teach. I really don't care. I have been trying to develop courses that has meaning, and I don't think it's useless. I think it's the most useful work I can do. And I think that what humanists need to do, someone said something about it on the panel, is to become active in defending the work that we do, what we write and what we teach. And that is going to make a difference in the whole issue of what is human. That's just my response to today's discussion.
Thank you very much. And I tell you, I think that given that all of you are invited to lunch, and I hope you'll take us up on that offer, we can continue the dialogue there. I want to thank the 4 panelists for their wonderful presentations and to all of you for your participation. Thank you very much. And again,